Frank Hyder is a well-known, renowned visual artist. When he started to become an artist, he thought the journey would be a straightforward progression. Over the years, he has discovered that the road has many twists and turns, numerous hills and valleys, and countless challenges. Through this series of short stories, tales, and remembrances, his hope is that these will offer some valuable insight into the life of an artist and what's involved in becoming an artist. In the end, he has come to realize that he is not a painter or sculptor or anything in particular. He is more simply a creative person with great passion and love for the process of making art concerning people and the world around us, who shares his artworks with the public. Join us now as we listen to another episode of A Life in Art series.
Art school is a place filled with interesting people. And when I got to art school for the very first time in my life, I was around people who I felt I could relate to and understand. In that gut of interesting people, there are oftentimes discoveries that are made only because you're with other artists, and things that are important to artists are not always important to other people. Anyway, I came into my figure painting class with that I was taking with Jim Hennessy, and Peter Loftus, who was a jovial, wonderfully liberal, open-minded painter who also had a rock and roll band that did Neil Young kind of covers, etc. Anyway, Peter was one of the more colorful characters in the classroom. He was a great storyteller, and he was a kind of a person who was maybe a little bit older than most of the other students, because he already had a wife and a child. But he also had this kind of laid-back, happy-go-lucky character. But he came into the class one day with the most fascinating piece of painting equipment I had ever seen. And at a distance, when I saw it, I was drawn over to it, and I watched as Peter set up his new painting box. I had never seen anything quite like it. And I know now it's what we call a French easel painting box. And the French easel painting boxes were invented by the French Impressionist painters of the 19th century, who wanted to be able to go out into the landscape and paint on uneven ground, sometimes maybe even standing in water, and they needed to be able to have a paint box that could carry all of their equipment. So anyway, Peter had bought this paint box, and when I saw it, I was so incredibly taken with it. I went over and I said, "Peter, where did you get this thing?" And he said, "Oh, they have them at the art store." And I said, "Really?" And he said, "Yeah." And I was admiring it. He showed me how it had a little drawer that pulled out, and a place to hold your paint, your brushes, and a place to hold your tubes of paint. And it was really well organized. And I said, "Well, I love this thing already. I got to go get one." So when we had a break, I went over to the art supply store, and I go in and I said, "I want to see the French easel box." And the guy says, "Well, we just got them in." And he pulls one out and he shows it to me, and I'm looking at it, and I said, "Well, how much do these things cost?" He says, "Oh, they're only $84. Now, $84, when at art school, the entire year's tuition was $1,600, $84 was a lot of money. And I didn't have $84. My rent was $41 a month, and $81 was more than 2 months worth of rent. So anyway, I said, "Oh, boy." So I went back to the painting room, and I watched Peter work on this paint box. And finally, towards the end of the class, I came up with an idea, and I somehow or another I convinced Peter that he should loan me the paint box for the weekend. And I don't even remember how I quite did it, but I know I got him to the point where he agreed to lend it to me for the weekend. He said, "But you've got to give it back to me on Monday." I said, "I will." So he gave me the paint box on Friday, and I got to my car, and I immediately drove to New Jersey, and I went into the house, and I said to my father, I said, look, see this paint box? We have to make one of these, and I have to have it by Monday. And my father looks at it. Now, I knew my father was a carpenter and he could do almost anything. And I said, yeah, we have to make this. And he said, well, I don't have all those parts. And I said, we'll do the best we can. You got to make this thing. So anyway, he proceeded to use whatever stuff he had, and he built me the box. And I had the box on Sunday, just as promised. And I drove back to Baltimore that night. And Monday morning, I gave back Peter his box, and I had my own box. Now, mine wasn't quite as finished looking because my father used various different kinds of woods together, but I had one, and I was working with it. But over the course of a couple of weeks working with it, I saw all kinds of little changes that I thought would make it better. Areas needed to be a little bigger. American materials were different size than French products in some cases, etc. So anyway, I went back to my father again, and I said, look, this is great, but let's make a better one, and I'm going to make these changes. I want to change the size of this, and I went over a whole bunch of all of my thoughts. So, and I said, and we don't have the same rush, so you can take a little bit more time because I'll keep using this other one until you get the new one made. So anyway, I went back to school, and then finally I showed back up a couple weeks later, and he had the box and it had all these improvements. And so now I had the better box because mine had been made to specifications that fit more our product. So anyway, I used the box, and everywhere I went, people asked me about it. So I had a friend who I had met at the Skowhegan School, and he was a painter, and he loved my paint box, and he said, do you think your father would make one of those for me? So I talked to my father, and I said, do you think you can make a few more of these? I think I might be able to sell them. So my father said, well, I don't mind. I could do that. So we came up with a price. We sold them for $75, which was about $10 cheaper than they were selling in the art stores. And he started making paint boxes, and pretty soon I was selling them to all kinds of people. But they were going to people who had famous reputations at some times. Anyway, my friend Jim took his paint box up to Yale, and a student that he knew at Yale, whose father was a famous playwright, Rebecca Miller, she liked the paint box, and she took it home. And anyway, she shared it with her father, the playwright. So anyway, time passed, and as I said, many, many very famous artists in New York were using my father's paint box. And how they were getting to know the box was because when I was a student, as a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania, these artists would come through my studio and they'd see my paint box and ask about it. And I told them I knew where they could get one for $75. So anyway, there they were. Some of the most famous painters of the time in New York had my father's paint box. So anyway, my friend Jim was getting married after a period of time, and the wedding was going to be held at Arthur Miller's house in Connecticut. And I was going to be part of the wedding party, so my wife and I were invited up to Connecticut for the weekend. So we go up, and there was a rehearsal night, and then after the rehearsal, we're all playing cards and drinking whiskey and smoking cigars, and Arthur Miller and the Reverend Sloane Coffin and the founder of the Palabolas dance group, all kinds of people, and we're all sitting around having a gay old time. And then the next morning, I'm just walking around there on Miller's farm, and Arthur comes up to me and he said, I understand you're responsible for that paint box. And I said, well, I don't know about responsible for it, but yeah, I was part of it anyway. And he then revealed to me that he had taken my father's paint box apart and copied it. And he had made a copy of it for his daughter, Rebecca, who was a painting student at Yale at the time. And so he was quite enamored with this whole idea of that I had been this person who had sort of had something to do with the making of this box. And he showed me his workshop. What a lot of people didn't know about him, he was quite a good woodworker, and he also didn't throw things away. So when a washing machine broke, he took it all apart so he could have all these little parts and he could use them to build something else out of. So he was really quite a creative and inventive guy, and that was a side that I don't think too many people would know. So anyway, he took my wife and I around his property, and then we ended up sitting, as we walked through the house, there were these Alexander Calder miniatures all over the house. And I asked about them, and he said, well, Sandy Calder used to come here all the time, and we'd just hang out, and while he'd be sitting there, he'd make these little things, and then he'd just leave them wherever he made them. He says there's a whole bunch of them all over the house. And we went down in the basement, and we saw where when Miller had lived there with Marilyn Monroe, they had poured the cement floor in the basement, and they put their handprints in the cement and signed it. And we ended up in his study, which was a converted silo from a barn. And in that study, we sat, and for 2 hours, Arthur told my wife and I stories of writing film scripts in Hollywood and the crazy people that ran the movie studios. And he said, believe me, if you ever made a movie about the real Hollywood, no one would believe it. He said, people did the strangest things. He said, Al Jolson's tomb crypt has music playing 24 hours a day for eternity. He paid the electric bill into infinity so that the music is always playing. And he went down a long list of all kinds of unique oddities that he associated with the Hollywood experience. And at a certain point, as he was talking, I kept staring at this drawing on the wall over top of his head behind where he was sitting. And at a certain point, I said, is that drawing you? And he said, yes, it is. He said, would you like to hear the story? I said, I actually would. What is the story? And he says, well, we were all out here one night drinking. Sandy Calder and Stuart Widmark and Marilyn Monroe, all these people. He said, we'd been drinking for hours. And he said, everybody was really under the influence of the alcohol pretty heavily. And he said, so I turned to Calder and I said, Calder, you're so messed up, you couldn't even draw a straight line. And Calder said, it doesn't matter how messed up I get, I can always draw. And he said, nah, I don't think so. He says, I think you're too far gone. And Calder said, what do you want me to draw? So he said, draw me. He said, where? He said, how about right here? And he pointed to the wall. So he says, all right, well, with what? And he says, well, here. And he gave him a felt tip pen. He said, do it with this. So Calder took the pen and then quickly proceeded to make the drawing. And there was the drawing of Arthur Miller. And he said, I told you I could do it. And he said, sign it. So Calder turned around and signed the drawing. He said the next morning, he said, I woke up hungover. Everybody was pretty much tanked out. He said, I came out here. I got an X-Acto knife. And he said, I cut out the piece of sheetrock where the drawing was. And I took it into town. And I had a picture framer frame it and mount it. And I came back and we patched the sheetrock. And then we hung this drawing right on the wall, right where he made it. And I'm pretty sure that drawing, right where I saw it, had been there since the night that he had made the drawing, and that probably the number of people that had heard that story was pretty small. But I thought it was a pretty special gift that paint box that my father had made for me and filled in on a weekend had led me to this place where I was now sitting in the room with one of the greatest writers in the English language, and I'm hearing this story, and I'm seeing this drawing, and I'm seeing all of this happen right in front of me, and it was all being traced back to that experience with that paint box that started in that art classroom with my old friend Peter Loftus.
Thank you for listening. If you have questions or suggestions for future episodes, please reach out to Frank Hyder on Facebook or Instagram. We hope to see you at one of the next A Life in Art episodes.